Currently, the Russian bear is smashing through Ukraine, and the help of NATO and America has been too little and too late. This is actually very tragic because both America and Russia, in the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, guaranteed security to Ukraine against any threat to Ukraine or her political independence from any enemy. And this was with the understanding that Ukraine would give up her nuclear arsenal, which she inherited from the Soviet Union. Another thing we currently see right associated with this buildup of troops and this war in Ukraine is that Russian troops are now building up in Belarus. Some of them have ready access to Lithuania, and many are on the Polish border. And the fact is that many citizens in the Baltic states and Poland fear that they may be next in line. Now, it's difficult to understand the current situation unless we fully understand the background. It's not enough merely to understand the perspective from the recent history of the military and geopolitical events, according to the military and geopolitical experts in the military and geopolitical think tanks. They have much to offer that fleshes out the story and fills in the details. But the fact is, we need to step back a little bit further and look at the big picture, which is outlined first and foremost in the Bible, and secondly, outlined by the behavior of the northern hordes since the times of the Gentiles began. Let's examine the backstory behind this situation, and let's start with the Bible. In the Bible, God gave primacy over Israel to the four nations of the times of the Gentiles. This is Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. This is God-given authority over their entire dominion, as well as over Israel. Now, in history, the northern hordes, which are composed of the Scandinavians, the Germans, the Gauls, and the Scythians, continually descended from up north and came down into the realm of these sovereignties of the times of the Gentile nations. And they entered into Europe and they entered into the Middle East, marauding, invading, conquering, setting up colonies. They did this for 2,500 years, challenging this authority. They have fought the God-established sovereignty of the Babylonians, the Medo-Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans. And ancient history is filled with these accounts. They actually overthrew the Roman Empire on several occasions. So the upshot is that the Gog and Magog invasion in Ezekiel 38 and 39, which we are seeing the initial setup for that right now before our very eyes, this Gog and Magog invasion isn't a one-off unique event in history. It is the Gog and Magog power coalition revisiting their historical expansionism and their historical colonizing and their historical challenging of the God-appointed powers of the times of the Gentiles, which they've been doing for 2,500 years. But what we see in Ezekiel 38 and 39 and what we see developing before our very eyes is the rise of a very vast juggernaut that seems to surpass anything we've ever seen in history past. And when Russia has accomplished her goals in her own frontiers up north, make no bones about it, when she's united all those northern hordes, the juggernaut is going to turn south to the Middle East with their eyes on Israel. Next, we need to examine Putin's goals for restoring the glory of the Russian Empire, whether they are explicitly stated or whether they are implicitly stated. That is, whether they are implied. Now, the West has seriously underestimated Putin's vision and determination. He's got numerous goals which he has plainly let the world know. First of all, he is going to restore free access to Kaliningrad so she is no longer an enclave accessible only through NATO nations. He's also going to bring all the Soviet bloc subordinates back under Russia's wing. Putin is determined to unite all the Slavic nations, Ukraine, Poland, etc. He has plainly stated that Ukraine is part of Russia. He wants to ensure that there is zero NATO presence on any Russian border, including Kaliningrad. He wants to ensure that there is no NATO presence on the Black Sea. He wants to ensure that there is no NATO presence on the Baltic Sea. He wants to gain control over the Skagerrak Strait between Denmark, Sweden, and Norway so the Russian Navy has free access to the North Sea and the Atlantic. He wants to fracture NATO and the EU. He wants to humiliate America and expose her as a has-been. He wants to expand Russia's favored trade partners, natural resources that are available, her labor pool, and the size of her military. Now, there are other significant factors to take into consideration. First of all, Putin and Russia are no longer intimidated by NATO and America. On top of that, Putin and Russia are prepared for the long haul with trade sanctions. They figure that they can lean on China and Iran, and that Turkey will eventually fall in line. Now, Europe stands to fare much worse with the trade sanctions than America or Russia will. This figures heavily in the events that are going to unfold in the next year or two. You can expect Europe to retreat. You're also another situation really that's very complex is that Turkey has closed the access to the Black Sea to warships. And this is going to hurt NATO and the U.S. more than Russia, unless she makes an exception for NATO ships. Because right now as it stands, the Russian ships that are operating in the Black Sea don't need to leave the Black Sea to do what they're doing. And NATO ships will have no access to the Black Sea to defend their NATO allies. Another thing to take into consideration is that Russia's military doctrine advises first strike with nuclear weapons in tactical battlefield situations if it is deemed necessary. And I want you to know that they have many small tactical nukes and many large EMP nukes, and Putin is not afraid to use them. Now let's examine the prophesied nations in Gog and Magog's invasion. We have Gog, Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal to start with. These are four leading Scythian or Slavic peoples that dwelt from the Black Sea north all the way to the Baltic Sea and east through southern Siberia all the way to the Great Wall of China. The Great Wall of China was actually referred to in Arabic history as the Wall of Magog. And all these Scythian nations, or these ancient Slavic nations, had colonies in modern Turkey and western Iran. Eventually, these Scythian nations melded together with the tremendous influx of Scandinavian bloodlines and became what we know as Russia. Rosh lent its name to the modern nation of Russia, Meshech lent its name to the capital city of Moscow, and to nicknames like Muscovy and Muscovite. Tubal lent its name to Tobolsk, Russia, and Tbilisi, Georgia. Now, the Scythian or Slavic peoples also populated Ukraine, Georgia, Poland, Czech Republic, and Slovakia. This seems to imply that their participation will also be seen in the unfolding of the Ezekiel prophecy. The next two nations to consider are Persia and Put. There is little dispute on the identity of these two. There's virtually unanimous agreement, although the Japhetic connection to the two is frequently missed. Persia obviously is Iran. Persia was first settled by Madai, who's known as Perses in Greek mythology, and he was a brother of Javan, who's the father of the Greeks. The Madai descendants mingled with the regional peoples and became what we know as Medes and the Persians and modern Iran. Put is Libya and Algeria, and it was settled by the North Sea peoples, a Japhetic people, who mingled with the Semitic and Hamitic folks that were already in the region. And these same North Sea peoples also founded the Phoenician Empire. The third one to look at is Kush. This can be either African Kush or Asian Kush. If it's Asian Kush, it includes all of the Stan nations that are east all the way to Pakistan. If it's African Kush, then it would be Ethiopia and Sudan. Personally, I think Asian Kush is a better choice because it fits the overall picture of nations of Japhetic derivation and colonization. The fourth one is Gomer. This is Gemiru with the Assyrians and Chimeria with the Greeks. Gomer was a son of Japheth according to the table of the nations in Genesis chapter 10. In the Roman times, the homeland of Gomer extended from modern Germany east to the Vistula River and from the North Sea and Baltic Seas south to the Danube River. Now, Gomer planted many colonies in the Balkans and in Anatolia, which is modern Turkey. And because of the vast range of their homeland and the vaster range yet of their colonization, their name has appeared all over on maps, which is why many people have been a little confused on where Gomer is. Now, the homeland of Germany was never a part of the Roman Empire. That means it's not likely to be part of the Roman Empire in the last days. That I expect that we're going to see the current EU and current NATO fracture. Lastly, we come to Beth Togarmah of the remote parts of the north. Now, few take the phrase the remote parts of the north literally. I wish this wasn't so, but it is. But I do take it literally. Now, in the table of the nations in Genesis chapter 10, we see that Togarmah was a descendant of Japheth through Gomer, and the ancient traditions have the sons of Togarmah originally settling in the region of the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, and then expanding northward, ultimately finding their homeland in the far north near their German cousins, though some of them stayed in the Black Sea region. Now, the fact that this house was involved in colonization and conquering left their name and their colonies in Turkey and the Russian steppes, lending their name to Turkmenistan and Turkey and to many local features like hills, mountains, rivers, and lakes and cities. In their homeland up in the north, their bloodlines are relatively pure, while in their colonized and conquered regions, their bloodlines are heavily mingled with the local peoples, primarily Semitic peoples. Now, I suspect that since the passage says House of Togarmah, that it covers Scandinavia as well as Turkey and all of the Stan nations. And as the Scandinavian nations were never part of the Roman Empire, I suspect that the House of Togarmah will also not be part of the Roman Empire in the last days. So looking at this information, we have what are Putin's next steps. This we can surmise if we correlate his stated goals and the names of the allied nations that are mentioned in Ezekiel 38 and 39. In a quick review of the nations that are mentioned in Ezekiel 38 and 39, we see Gomer, which is Germany. We see Togarmah, which is Scandinavia. We see Turkey, which is a mixture of Gomer and Togarmah and the Scythian bloodlines mixed with the local bloodlines. And we see all of the Stan nations, which are, again, the House of Togarmah, mingled with a little Scythian and Gomerian blood, and lots of the local bloodlines. Really what this amounts to is that the northern hordes who descended from Japheth and their colonies dwelt in the tents of Shem, even as the scriptures said they would. Now, if we review the goals that Putin has stated, we see that there's no presence going to be permitted for NATO in the Black Sea, in the Baltic Sea or on Russian borders. We see that Kaliningrad is going to be integrated, territorially united with Russia, and we see that there's a plan to unite all the Slavic peoples in one empire, and there's a plan to restore the entire Soviet bloc empire. These goals require Germany, Scandinavia, Poland, and Turkey to join the Russian orbit. So what is the immediate step that we're going to see Russia and Putin take? First of all, we're going to see Putin finish off Ukraine. He will take Ukraine no matter what it costs him or his nation. He will be ruthless and vengeful. He will use scorched earth policies and make the nation pay for not submitting weakly to Mother Russia. For not submitting meekly, to Mother Russia. He will use the most powerful non-nuclear weapons in his arsenal. And I want you to know that this crushing military effort is just as much intimidation for his future targets as it is to finish the current battle. He's warning the nations around, don't force your nation and your people to suffer like Ukraine is suffering. They didn't have to suffer. They could have submitted. They didn't suffer. They paid. And if you don't submit, you will pay. But what's the next step after Ukraine is completely obliterated and brought into Russian orbit? In my estimation, the next most likely stop is the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. There's several reasons for this. First of all, we have the Slavic issue. The Baltic nations are closely related to the Slavic peoples that dwell in Russia. They share DNA with them as well as with the Hungarian Finnish family. And Putin has expressly stated that he wants to unite the entire Slavic family. Another issue is the NATO border issue. He wants no NATO nations on the border of Russia. This infuriates him and irritates most Russians in the military and in the government. We also have the Kaliningrad issue. Putin wants territorial integrity with Kaliningrad. We have the sea access issue. Putin wants the ports in Riga, Latvia, and Tallinn, Estonia to be part of his empire. We have the NATO free sea issue. Putin wants no NATO influence in the Baltic Sea. However, Putin might also elect to go straight for the jugular and worry about the Baltic states later. He might go straight for the remaining Slavic nations, which puts Poland right in his sights. And there are several reasons for this. Again, we see the Slavic issue at play. These nations are the western branch of the Scythian or Slavic family. We see the NATO border issue at play. Poland borders on Kaliningrad, which is part of Russia proper, and it borders on Belarus, which is Russia's closest ally. We see the NATO free sea issue. He wants no NATO forces on the Baltic Sea. We see the German draw. The Russian army would now be on the border of Germany, and this would intimidate Germany, and it would also be an attractive, lucrative trading partner for Russia. I expect that we can see Russia intimidating Germany and enticing her with the offer of natural gas, petroleum, coal, and other natural resources, as well as a lucrative trading partner. But either way, whether Putin rolls into the Baltic states next or whether he rolls into Poland, there is going to be a NATO showdown coming. And Putin honestly doesn't care whether he takes the Baltic states or Poland by war or capitulation. Wherever he goes, he is going to likely offer his opponent an ultimatum to switch sides or face annihilation, like Ukraine did, or even worse. If the nation says no, he will invade. Now, no matter which of these directions he takes, whether the Baltic states or Poland, it was going to put him toe-to-toe with NATO. But he is not afraid of this. He wants this. He will have battle-hardened troops fresh off of victory facing NATO. This is going to be the ultimate stare down, and NATO will likely blink first. If NATO responds with any significant military force, I expect Putin to use tactical nukes and massive EMP nukes to debilitate the NATO forces and the communication services in the region. A single airburst EMP nuclear device would pretty much throttle the ability of NATO and the EU to respond to Russian advances. Putin is dead serious about his Russian expansionism and ridding himself of the NATO threat. On top of this, I expect that America will not respond fast enough or with sufficient force enough to make any difference in his next move. This is going to play greatly into the upcoming election, and it's also going to play greatly into the future events that unfold in Europe. The fact is, if NATO and America don't step up to the plate for full-fledged war, Putin's gambit is going to prevail, and NATO will be seen as weak and will, for all practical purposes, collapse, and nations like Germany and Turkey are going to find themselves forced to consider full alignment with Russia or war with Russia. Eventually, many other nations and regions are going to be engulfed by this juggernaut. If we take Putin's stated and implied goals at face value, and if we consider the nations mentioned in Ezekiel 38 and 39, then we can expect the following blocks of nations to fall like dominoes in the ensuing years. I think we're going to see the Scandinavian nations, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, along with Finland, fall. This will be over NATO border issues. Norway is a current member with a border on Russia. Finland is a potential member with a long border with Russia. This is over NATO Baltic Sea issues. Sweden and Finland have signaled interest in joining NATO. This is a serious issue here. Putin has already threatened Sweden and Finland with serious consequences if they seek NATO membership. This is also an issue over the Skagerrak Strait because Russia wants uninhibited, unrestrained access to the North Sea and the Atlantic from the Baltic Sea. This is also over oil and natural resources. But we can also expect to see the Baltic Peninsula, which is Moldova, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Serbia, etc., fall to the Russian juggernaut. For similar reasons, NATO forces on the Black Sea, they're former Soviet bloc nations. There's a tremendous breadbasket for agriculture, and there's a lot of industry and natural resources there. Ultimately, I expect to see Germany and Turkey fall into Russia's orbit. For the same kind of reasons again. Russia wants no NATO presence on the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea. If Germany and Turkey fall into the Russian orbit, this is going to be a financial disaster for the EU, and it's going to be a military disaster for NATO. Not only will this be a tremendous diminishment of NATO clout, but there will no longer be access to the Black Sea or the Baltic Sea to American and NATO ships. I expect that we're going to see Germany and Turkey wooed by Russia with tremendous financial, energy, and military incentives. I wouldn't be surprised if China, though she has her own tensions with Russia, is in the mix because these two enemies become great friends when they're opposed to the great Satan of America. In conclusion, I think that we are going to see some tremendous turbulence and war in Europe in the near future. I think we're either going to see the Baltic states or Poland face the same kind of threats that Ukraine faced, and whether they surrender and capitulate or whether they trust NATO and get crushed remains to be seen. Now, I wouldn't shed one tear if NATO actually stood up and defended their allies and pushed the Russian juggernaut back. I'm skeptical that this is going to happen, and if it happens, I can't see it happening for very long. The Russian juggernaut is going to roll. Until next time, eyes wide open, brain engaged, heart on fire.